Today we're going to be looking at something pretty fascinating, the idea that language itself has a hidden rhythm. And this isn't just about poetry or music or anything like that. This is about how our brains actually process language. And we're using a section from our founder, Andrew Reid's dissertation thesis, as our guide today. It brings us these really interesting connections to how we experience time. It is really intriguing how language isn't just like this isolated system in our minds, right? It's built on top of much more fundamental cognitive processes. I mean, think about it. Before we even speak, we're already surrounded by rhythms, like our heartbeat, the rise and fall of our parents' voices, the cycles of day and night, all this weird and wonderful stuff. The paper uses this phrase, language as emergent behavior. What does that actually mean? Well, think of it this way. Language doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It emerges from these deeper, rhythmic processes that we were just talking about, our brain's abilities to perceive and understand time. The dissertation paper suggests that these timing processes are hardwired into us, that they were essential for survival even in our earliest ancestors. So it's as if language is layered on top of these primal rhythms that are already there. And there's some really compelling evidence to support this. For example, the dissertation talks about this idea called the 3-second rule. And now, this is where things get really interesting. Just what is this 3-second rule all about? It sounds like a rule for reheating leftovers, right? Well, it's not about leftovers, but it does deal with a kind of limit. It's the observation that we seem to have this natural constraint on how much information we can consciously focus on at once. And that constraint is about 3 seconds. It applies to both language and music. In both, there seems to be an attention window of 3 seconds. Think about how long a musical phrase lasts before you get a pause or a change. Or try to remember a phone number without writing it down. You're probably chunking it into groups of about 3 or 4 digits. It's all within that 2 to 3 second range. Try it and see for yourself. It's like our brains can only handle information in these bite-sized chunks. And that actually leads us to another concept from the paper, intonation units. Intonation units sounds complicated, doesn't it? So, what exactly are we talking about then? Well, think of them as like the natural chunks of spoken language. They're typically around 2 to 3 seconds long, and they're marked by pauses, changes in pitch, little cues that signal a break in the flow of speech. And guess what? They line up perfectly with those 3-second bursts of focused attention. So even the way we speak is naturally structured around this 3-second rule. It's like our brains are automatically chopping things up for us. That's what it seems like, and that's exactly what it does. And we can even take this deeper, neurologically speaking. The paper delves into how our brains have this system for storing sounds in the short term. It's called the phonological loop. You can imagine this as a kind of temporary recording loop inside your head. It can only hold a limited amount of sound information and only for a short time. And guess what? The capacity of this loop, you guessed it. It seems to be limited by that same 2 to 3 second time frame. So we've got this 3-second rule popping up everywhere, from how long we can hold a melody in our heads, to how we naturally speak, to the very capacity of our short-term memory for sounds. It's remarkable. One excerpt from the paper even cites some fascinating experiments where researchers found that people could only recall as many words as they could actually say in about 2 seconds. It's as though our brains have this built-in timer for processing language. By now, you might be thinking about how we learn new languages. Does this timing aspect have any implications for how we pick up new words and grammar? Well, that's a great question. And it's actually something the paper discusses later, particularly when it explores the connections between musical training and language skills. But before we jump ahead, let's dive into the parts of the brain that actually handle this whole timing and rhythm business. Let's bring on the brain science. 1.25s. What areas of the brain are we talking about here? We're going to focus on 2 main areas: the cerebellum and the basal ganglia. These are known to be involved in movement and coordination. Some of you may remember learning about them in a psychology class, for example. But here's the really interesting part. Those areas aren't just for movement. They're involved in language processing too. And what's even more intriguing is that damage to these areas can actually cause problems with both physical coordination and speech. The paper highlights how people with damage to the cerebellum often show signs of speech disorders, particularly with irregularities in things like stress and speaking rate. Their speech can sound almost robotic because it lacks those natural changes in rhythm and intonation that we usually don't even think about. So it's like the brain's sense of rhythm is actually shaping the rhythm of our speech itself. It all points to this incredibly strong link between music and language, a link that goes all the way down to the neurological level. Later on, the dissertation actually compares a sentence to a melody. And it really drives home the idea that language has this inherent musicality. It's a powerful analogy. And there's a lot of evidence from brain imaging studies to back it up. When researchers scan people's brains while they're listening to music or processing language, similar areas light up in both activities. So it's not just a feeling, that sense that language can be musical, it's literally happening in our brains. And this brings up a really interesting question about the traditional view of language as this purely left brain function. We usually regard the left brain for logic and language, and the right brain for creativity and music. That idea isn't completely outdated, but it's definitely more nuanced than that. Recent research suggests both hemispheres are involved in language processing. And what's interesting is that the right brain might be especially important for processing those more musical aspects of speech, like pitch, tone, melody, and so on. So it's not just a simple left brain, right brain split. It's more like both sides working together to create this incredible symphony of language. And this brings us back to the earlier idea about the implications for language learning. The paper actually suggests that musical training might be able to enhance language skills. In fact, there's a growing body of evidence suggesting that music and language are deeply intertwined in our brains. So engaging in musical activities could definitely have positive effects on how we process language. It's like this intricate tapestry of sounds and rhythms. Yet, we've only just scratched the surface here. There's so much more to explore in this amazing world where music and language intersect. So far, we've seen how music and language might be intertwined in the brain, but how does that actually play out in real life? Like, does musical training really have an impact on language skills? Well, that's a question that researchers are really digging into, and the findings are pretty interesting. The dissertation mentions several studies showing that musicians tend to have better verbal memory than non-musicians. They're also better at picking up on the subtle changes in pitch and rhythm that are so important for understanding the nuances of speech. It makes sense when you think about it. Musicians are trained to be hyper-aware of sound and rhythm, and the paper even suggests that musical training might be particularly helpful for kids who are learning language. It cites studies showing that early musical experiences can really boost language development and improve literacy skills later on. So introducing music to kids at a young age could give them a real advantage when it comes to language. There are even programs like Kinder Music and Music Together that are specifically designed to use music as a way to encourage language development in young children. It's like music is this universal language with the power to unlock so much potential in the brain. And the excerpt also mentions a therapy called the interactive metronome. So what exactly is that all about? The interactive metronome is a therapy that uses rhythm to help people improve their timing and coordination. It's been used to help people with a variety of conditions, including ADHD, dyslexia, dementia, and Alzheimer's, and even autism. So it's not just about music, it's about training the brain's underlying sense of rhythm, which could then have these ripple effects on other skills like language. The interactive metronome involves things like tapping your fingers or toes along with a steady beat. And the therapeutic program provides feedback on your timing to help you get more precise. It's like giving your brain a rhythmic tune-up. While the research on the interactive metronome is still ongoing, there are some promising findings, particularly for improving attention focus and even speech fluency. If language and music are so deeply intertwined in the brain, then training one might actually strengthen the other. It's like cross-training for your brain. So, till now, we've been focusing a lot on the left brain and its role in language. But the excerpt also brings up something that is really attention-grabbing. The idea that the traditional view of language as purely a left brain function might be a bit oversimplified. We've all heard that left brain for logic and language, right brain for creativity and music idea, right? Right. Although that's not necessarily wrong, it is much more complex than that. Recent research suggests that both hemispheres are involved in language processing. And what's interesting is that the right brain might be especially important for processing those more musical elements of speech that we talked about earlier. Things like intonation and how we use our voices to convey emotion. So it's like the right brain is adding all the color and emotion to the language canvas, while the left brain is handling the structure and the grammar. It really captures the idea that language is this holistic process involving both sides of the brain. And the dissertation paper actually cites some studies that support this. For example, people with damage to the right hemisphere often have trouble understanding and expressing emotion in their speech. They might speak in a flat, monotone voice, even though their grammar and vocabulary are perfectly intact. So it's not just what you say, but how you say it. And that's where the right brain comes in. This notion challenges the traditional idea of language as this purely logical left brain function. It points to language being much more holistic, involving both the analytical skills of the left brain and the emotional intelligence of the right brain. It's really fascinating. Think about how we use language for so many different purposes. We use it to convey information, sure, but also to build relationships, express our feelings, and even create art. It's not just about logic, it's about connection and expression. Language is this incredibly versatile tool, and understanding how both sides of the brain contribute to it gives us a much deeper appreciation for how complex and beautiful human communication really is. It really is amazing. And the dissertation even goes a step further and suggests that this interplay between the left and right brain and language might actually have evolutionary roots. For one, it's fascinating to think about how language evolved. And the paper proposes that the musical elements of language might have actually predated the more grammatical structural elements. In fact, it suggests that our early ancestors might have used sounds and rhythms to communicate emotions and intentions, long before they had complex grammar and syntax. It's like this proto-language of emotions and rhythms arose before actual language itself, and it really reinforces this idea that music and language share deep neurological roots. And that's a mind-blowing thought to consider, that our capacity for music might have actually paved the way for our capacity for language. It makes you wonder if music is woven into the very essence of what makes us human. And speaking of music, there's a particularly fascinating section of the dissertation where the author compares the human voice to a musical instrument. We use our breath and vocal cords to produce sound just like a trumpet or a violin, for instance. But it goes deeper than that. The author argues that just like a musical instrument, the human voice is capable of producing this incredible range of tones, pitches, and rhythms. And we use these variations to communicate meaning and emotion in our speech. It's like we're all walking around with these finely tuned instruments inside of us, and we're constantly composing these little symphonies with our voices. It's a beautiful thought. The dissertation even takes this analogy a step further and suggests that the way we arrange syllables in a sentence can be compared to a musical score. It even uses musical notation to represent the stress patterns in different types of meter, like iambic pentameter. The author's premise is all about seeing language through a musical lens, and it really highlights the importance of timing and rhythm in how we speak. Just like a musician has to be precise with their timing to create a melody. A speaker has to use rhythm and intonation effectively to get their message across and keep their listeners engaged. It makes you think about those people who are just naturally gifted speakers, those who have a way with words that captivates you. Maybe they have this intuitive understanding of the musicality of language. They were born with perfect pitch for speech. Maybe those great speakers are just really good at keeping the beat in their brains. And if that's true, maybe we can all become better speakers by tapping into that inner musician and paying more attention to the rhythm of our speech. And that is an exciting thought. It speaks to the power of this deep dive itself. How it's making us think differently about language and its possibilities. It truly is an eye-opening conversation. and one which needs to be delved into deeper. The brain's timing mechanisms, the musicality of language, the roles of both hemispheres, and the evolutionary roots of language. The paper also dives into some really fascinating cross-cultural research, looking at how different languages use rhythm and intonation in unique ways. It makes sense that different languages would have different rhythms. But how does that actually work? For example, the thesis contrasts English, which is what's called a stress-timed language, with languages like French and Spanish, which are syllable-timed. So what's the difference? It has to do with how the rhythm of the language is organized. In stress-timed languages like English, the stressed syllables tend to occur at fairly regular intervals, regardless of how many unstressed syllables are in between. So it's like the stressed syllables are the anchors of the rhythm. You might say that the stressed syllables kind of cluster around them. Think of a phrase like, I went to the store. The stressed syllables found in the words went and store create the rhythmic backbone of the phrase, even though there are more syllables between them. So in English, it's the emphasis on certain syllables that defines the rhythm. And what about syllable-timed languages then? How does their rhythm work? In syllable-timed languages, all the syllables tend to have a more even duration, whether they're stressed or not. So the rhythm feels more flowing and even. This means that each type of language has its own kind of musicality. But how does that affect the way people speak? Well, the dissertation suggests that, according to some research, these differences in rhythmic structure can actually influence how speakers of different languages perceive and process time. Wow, pretty amazing, right? So the reality is that language isn't just a tool for communication. It's actually shaping our perception of reality. It's a powerful thought, and it highlights just how deeply language influences our cognition and our worldview. This entire deep dive has been a revelation, with ideas encouraging us to see language in this whole new light, not just as words and grammar, but as this vibrant rhythmic system that's connected to our brains, our bodies, and our very experience of the world. It really is something to contemplate, isn't it? Ponder on this. If language is inherently musical, does that mean we're all composing little symphonies every time we open our mouths to speak? That is a beautiful question to think about. It really speaks to this idea that we've been exploring. That language is more than just a way to convey information. It's a way to connect, to express ourselves, to create. And what's so exciting is that by understanding this rhythmic dimension of language, we can actually tap into that creative potential even more. So as we wrap up our deep dive today, what are some of the key things listeners should walk away with? Well, first and foremost, to never look at language the same way again. It's not just about rules and dry definitions. It's a dynamic, expressive system that's deeply connected to our emotions and how our brains experience the world. Before now, perhaps you've been listening to language in black and white, and now you can finally experience it in full color. Hopefully, listeners will be inspired to learn more about the brain and its incredible capacity for language. The more we understand about how it all works, the more we can unlock its potential for learning communication and creativity. It's amazing to think that we're only just scratching the surface of what there is to know about the brain and language. There are so many mysteries still to unravel, and that's what makes this feel so fascinating. It's a lot to think about, and we want to thank you, our listener, for joining us on this deep dive into the rhythm of language. We hope you've enjoyed the journey and that you'll keep exploring this fascinating world of words and sounds. Until next time, keep those synapses firing. And remember that, at Online Super Tutors, we appreciate the need for great communication and a holistic approach to learning. Our experts can help you to understand yourself, your strengths, your weaknesses, and how to overcome your challenges in the world of academia and throughout your working career. Our experts can help you to understand yourself, your strengths, your weaknesses, and how to become a master of your challenges in the world of academia and throughout your working career. If you like what you've seen and heard today, get in touch with us and let's continue our learning journeys together.